There is something about money that most people rarely notice. The people who are most careful in everyday life are not always the ones making the most rational financial decisions. Sometimes the opposite happens because the stronger someone wants to be seen as a good person, the more likely they are to make inefficient money decisions. Some purchases are driven less by need and more by the desire to let other people see that you care. Investment choices can also follow stories that feel morally right instead of being guided by risk and long-term logic. The problem is not good intentions themselves, but the moment money starts becoming a tool for building personal identity. At that point, financial decisions begin following social perception instead of simple mathematics. This is one of the least discussed ideas in personal finance. Good intentions do not always create good financial outcomes. Today we are looking at why genuinely good people often make poor money decisions without even realizing it. Money is supposed to be simple, moving in, moving out, growing over time, or becoming smaller. But in modern life, money no longer serves only a practical purpose because it also becomes a language for expressing who we are. The things we buy gradually begin to be treated as reflections of our personal values instead of simple purchases. Cars, food, investments, and even banks can slowly turn into symbols that people associate with identity. The problem begins when financial decisions are judged less by whether they make sense and more by whether they appear socially acceptable. To me, this is where many financial mistakes quietly begin without attracting much attention at first. Once social validation becomes part of money decisions, rational thinking gradually starts losing its influence. Little by little, we begin paying for how something looks instead of the value it actually provides. What makes this even more difficult is that the decision can still feel completely right while it happens. In the end, what we purchase is often not only the product itself, but also the version of ourselves that we hope other people will see. Not every bad financial decision looks like a mistake at the beginning because some of them appear completely reasonable. Buying a more expensive product because it feels more ethical, or investing because a trend appears morally appealing can seem completely justified. On the surface, the choice simply looks like the responsible thing to do. What often goes unnoticed is the long-term cost attached to that decision over time. The extra money spent to feel or appear better often does not return as measurable financial value over the long term. Over a long enough time horizon, those small differences continue compounding into a much wider financial gap. The issue is not intelligence, but that the decision is no longer being driven by efficiency. Instead, the decision gradually becomes more connected to personal identity than financial efficiency. Identity is often influenced by emotion much more than by careful financial logic. This is where many well-intentioned people gradually weaken their own financial stability without realizing it. Imagine two people buying the exact same product at exactly the same price. One chooses it for quality and efficiency, while the other chooses it to reflect a personal value. From the outside, the purchase looks identical, but the motivation behind it is completely different. Over a long time horizon, that difference in motivation influences how consistent financial decisions become. Someone focused on efficiency often keeps using the same system for many years. Someone driven by identity is more likely to keep changing with shifting social validation. That is why many portfolios become unstable because the owner keeps changing direction instead of the market. In my view, this is a type of risk that rarely receives much attention. The risk is not inside the investment itself, but inside the psychology behind each decision. And this type of psychological risk never appears on any chart. To understand this problem more clearly, we first need a simple way to organize our thinking. I call this framework the identity versus impact matrix. It separates two ideas that often become mixed together in everyday money decisions. Identity asks whether a choice makes us appear like a good, smart, or caring person. Impact asks whether that same choice actually creates meaningful financial or social results over time. The problem begins when identity becomes the main focus behind our financial choices. At the same time, the actual impact slowly fades into the background. Because something can feel completely right while still being inefficient in practice, and something that looks ordinary can quietly create far greater long-term impact. In the next section, we'll examine how this matrix appears inside everyday financial decisions. When you look more closely, not every money decision can be judged as simply right or wrong because another dimension often stays hidden beneath the surface. Identity and impact combine into four very different quadrants, and this is where many people lose their direction without realizing it. The first quadrant is high impact and low identity, where ordinary-looking decisions can produce strong, long-term financial results through compounding. Simple examples include boring long-term investing or efficient spending that happens without any social validation. The second quadrant is high impact and high identity, where a financial decision also feels personally meaningful at the same time. The challenge is that this ideal quadrant is not always available, and not every decision naturally belongs there. The third quadrant is low impact and low identity, covering small decisions that usually change very little over time. The fourth quadrant is low impact and high identity, and it carries the greatest financial risk within this framework. This is where money can appear morally correct while remaining financially inefficient because the purchase reflects identity more than results. Without noticing it, many people spend most of their financial decisions inside this quadrant over a long time horizon. One of the strongest forces behind financial decisions is often not the market, but the social environment around us. Most people rarely notice how much other people influence the way they choose to spend their money over time. Even highly rational people can begin making different financial choices after spending enough time inside a particular group. Money does more than move through the economy because it also communicates messages between people. People often want to appear responsible, caring, and socially aware when others are watching. Over time, those social signals can quietly shift financial decisions away from efficiency and toward validation. This is not necessarily a moral failure, but a very human response to social pressure. The problem begins when that pressure goes unnoticed and starts to feel completely rational. At that point, it becomes difficult to tell whether the choice comes from personal logic or simply from following the crowd. When this pattern becomes part of financial behavior, its effects can remain for a very long time. At this point, the real issue is becoming clear. It is not a lack of financial knowledge, but the number of decisions being shaped by personal identity. Letting go of identity is difficult because it often feels like part of who we are. One important detail is often overlooked. Personal identity does not always have to be expressed through spending money. Someone can still be a good person without paying an extra price to prove it. Caring about something does not automatically require buying the most expensive version of its symbol. Financial strength begins when money is no longer being used to look for personal validation. Once that changes, money begins returning to its original role as a practical tool instead of part of someone's identity. Financial decisions gradually become calmer, more consistent, and more rational over time. The change does not come from caring less, but from seeing financial choices with greater clarity. Clear financial judgment can carry more weight than good intentions that remain difficult to control. Being a good person and managing money effectively should never have to compete with each other over the long term. The problem begins when financial choices become a way to prove that we are good instead of simply serving their purpose. In the end, meaningful impact is often measured less by today's purchase and more by what remains possible over a longer time horizon. A healthy financial system gives someone one advantage that is easy to overlook: the ability to choose. Those choices create room to genuinely help when the moment arrives instead of only appearing helpful beforehand. One quiet paradox is that constantly trying to look generous can slowly reduce the ability to create larger impact later. This channel explores money as a system that quietly shapes everyday life rather than a symbol of status. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode here on The Margin.